Good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining the May 3rd, 2018 VOLTHA TST call. A reminder, we are recording the session so we can post it to the VOLTHA playlist after the meeting. So keep that in mind during presentations and discussions. And on the agenda, yes? Is there a question? Okay. We have a couple items on the agenda today. So first, rather than going over status for items in Sprint 1, what I wanted to do is go back to the work we started at the lockdown with doing the ref release planning for 2.0 and start to fill in some of the gaps we have for leads for scope items and contributors, and then also recap where we are right now on assessing the schedule and resources and dependencies, because we do need to get at least a draft updated schedule out on the wiki. And I'd like to come out of today's meeting with some sort of agreement on what we should put for a target release date for this initial draft we're putting out, knowing that that can be subject to change, because I think we're still in the process of identifying our contributors for some key areas. And we're still a bit away from having the full set of requirements for some of the items as well. So there's ongoing discussion. So following that, so that'll take about the first half of today's meeting, and then we'll go into a presentation from AT&T to drive discussion related to security requirements for MVP for VOLTHA 2.0. So those are our two key items to go over today. Any questions before we start? All right, so what I'd like to do is go back to some draft slides for the release planning. And this was sort of following the approach that had been done for 1.0 in terms of figuring out who was leading the specific scope items, so that will help me figure out also who to go talk to when I have issues related to specific feature items or scope items. So I've mapped over the names, if I can, whoops, I have that on the other screen. Let me bring that slide over here. From our previous discussion, we had company level assignments identified on here. And then we have, of course, the open items that are under discussion right now, including the one we'll target for today. So I'd mapped over the names, for example, from the companies that are signed up for specific scope items. I mapped those into the other slide deck. So I think I can put this one away now. And then as we have the specific individuals identified, if possible, I'd like to include them here so I have a sense of how many people we have available working on items, since we have a lot of content in this release, and I'm trying to figure out what we're going to have available for some of the later sprints as well. So I'd like assistance with that. We can do that offline if we're not prepared to do that today. I'll go over kind of my initial ones that I've put down just based on either I know of only one person working on it today, for example. So OpenOMCI stack. Chip, I put you down as the technical lead for that. Are you comfortable with that?
Yes.
Okay. And then the hope here is that we'll be able to add a couple additional names to the contributor column here and have a better pool for development for this. And then Shad, let me see, are you on today? Yes, you are. Yes. So I put you down as the technical lead on OpenOLT adapter, because at this point, my understanding, I think, is you're still the only person working on that. So it's single resource. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's right, Julie.
Okay. And then Kim, following what we've done with the 1.x releases, I have you down as the technical lead for here. I'm still working on a separate meeting related to the device management specifically for Edge Core. And so I'm hoping out of that we'll have a better sense of the path forward. I wanted to postpone that meeting until something else I have scheduled later today to see if we get some progress on that from a separate meeting. And if not, then I will work with you to schedule something else. Are you all right with me having your name down here at this time? Because that's how we've been proceeding for the previous releases.
it's okay for the time being, and then we'll just have to see how it shakes out later.
Okay,
Okay.
that's fine for me. Thank you. All right. And then the other items, right now, I just have company names for everything. So I'd like to get these filled in for my reference at least with individual names if possible. So if everyone could start taking that back and giving it some thought, I'll see what I can do. Maybe I can make this editable on Google Drive or something, or else I can work with people individually to pull in names here. And then we also have our page 2 for items as well. And then we do have AT&T driving discussion to lead to requirements for these 3 items here. But once that discussion is done, then we have some requirements identified, we still need to identify who will be leading the development work for that, for these 3 topics. So that, for example, is still a TBD. So we still have a lot of gaps in the planning for 2.0. I wanted to make sure we bring that up for attention. Any questions from the group today on this discussion so far? Okay. Then the next item I wanted to go to is the draft I've got here. Oh, my column width did something strange. That's a little bit better. Okay. So this is taking a look at the info I have collected from folks so far on trying to estimate for the work we have scoped out right now, how many sprints would be required based on the current development contributors that we have at the moment. So OpenOMCI and OpenOLT, these are the only 2 right now that I have estimates for from folks, and that was fairly easy to collect since we have just individual contributors right now. So where we are right now is OpenOMCI. That, unless we get more development contributors identified, we've got 10 plus sprints to complete that work. So there are some items that are still very kind of roughly scoped in because they're design spikes, and the amount of time required for the development may vary once those design spikes come in. And then we have a couple items that were low on the prioritization list that perhaps could be postponed if needed. But right now, this is something that's definitely driving our schedule. And then also, I suspect that technology profiles may end up falling in that same category. But at this point, we don't yet have a firm sense of how many sprints are required, unless I have more info from any of the folks on the call today. But I expect the answer is no. I'll just give a second for comments if anyone has any on technology profiles.
This is Sean Bissett here. So yeah, I haven't heard back from our development team in terms of scoping that at this point. So from our perspective, yeah.
Okay, so this one, I'm expecting it to have a fair number of sprints involved. The good news is from the previous discussions that we do have multiple companies that are expecting to be working on the development for this. So that's a plus. But until we have a sense of how those are going to be allocated across different features or different aspects of the development of our technology profiles, we won't have a good sense, I think, of how many sprints that will require. So I'd like to get that sorted out while we're in this, since we know the development work isn't scheduled to start until sprint 2 for this, then we've got a couple weeks left to try and sort that out and get it mapped appropriately. So on a related note, I wanted to let folks know I do have a short, just a 30-minute call scheduled on Monday that we'll use for trying to identify how to distribute the work for the various, I don't know what you want to call them. I think Sean referred to them as modules on the other call, but the various development areas, or I think Sean Bissett, you had referred to it maybe as layers, for how to assign the work. So I'd like to have that call on Monday. It's scheduled, I think, at 10:30 Pacific for 30 minutes. I just did that last night, got that coordinated. And then we'll be inviting anyone who would like to attend that, who's planning to contribute to the development work. If you're able to attend, then that would be great to help us try and get a sense for how to divide up the work. So just a little note about that. I'll make a note in the minutes as well. And Sean Missette, do you have a list of the folks from the previous discussion that you would like me to add to the list for the invite? If you do have one, you can send it to me afterwards and I can send out the meeting invitation. But I'll also put, like I said, a note about it in the meeting minutes from today so people have that information. Okay.
Yeah,
so
I do have a list I can send. I mean, I'll forward it to you after the meeting.
Okay, thank you. All right. And then for the top two items on here, David Bainbridge, I wanted to check with you. I believe Ken is still out of the office. Were you able to get a response internally from your team on kind of the expected or the estimated number of sprints? Actually, I think first we were looking at what needed to be scoped into sprint 1.
Yeah, I think, yeah, we looked at what needed to be scoped in sprint 1. They were supposed to go through and augment some, or at least identify the JIRAs that need to be done. I'm thinking they're both probably going to be multi-sprint events, though.
I expect so as well. I took just a very, not even back of the envelope necessarily, but a rough attempt at looking at based on what happened with 1.3. I sort of estimated that the combined work that's going on for everything, well, let's see if I can go over to the board. Let me find the right one. For the different epics that Ken had entered user stories for, I just took a rough estimate and guessed that I think it's probably going to end up about 3 sprints.
Yeah, that sounds about right.
Resourcing. Okay. So that was just my initial estimate that I wanted to. I'm trying to find my slides again. Let me. Yes.
So basically, because of containerization adapters, all that kind of stuff, would that become a restructured core? Are they the dependency of some other work to follow?
There is some some dependency here. So I think probably what I'm going to do is I'm just going to put the 3 right here on the restructure for the core. So the containerization of PondSim I had included in the story point, so I used to come up with this 3. So really what I have here is my estimate was for the stories that Sienna has right now that they've scoped, that they've put in estimates.
So after we do the adapter work, after we provide the infrastructure, if you will, for containerized adapters, there's going to be work on every adapter's part, and that is separate work that needs to be identified, scheduled
by the owner of the adapter, right? So
right.
So that, assuming that can be done now in parallel. David, so
not assuming it can be done in parallel. So I think our discussion last meeting was that because of the dependencies, we need to, at least a fair amount of the restructuring has to happen first. I don't know if it can start in parallel with one of the later sprints. It probably depends on what gets accomplished first for this restructuring.
But one question I have, one thing was there is a PondSim V2. Is that already containerized?
There's one PondSim that is containerized. I'm not sure. I'll be honest. I'm not sure what people are considering V2 for PondSim.
On the folder, they call it V2. So on the repository, they call it V2.
Okay.
So Sean, there is this epic for containerizing PondSim. the PONSIM adapter. So this work is still to be done. So that may be independent of your question, I think, but just wanted to point that out, that we do have some work slated for containerizing the PONSIM adapter.
Okay.
And so I think that is likely going to proceed. I was thinking this is probably going to start in Sprint 1 as well. I'm not totally sure on that. But I think for these slides that I have, that this, I'll look at it as the individual adapters, and then that's going to start further down the road and has a dependency on this here. Okay, so then the remaining items, I think we talked on our last meeting that we need sort of a dedicated team built up to work on what will be required to finalize the device management, at least, for EdgeCore, for the EdgeCore adapter with the Redfish work that was done previously, and how to make sure everything's working together in an integrated fashion. And then a couple other items that were on our planning roadmap here, like the software component upgrade. We were expecting this likely will be documentation only, but I do have it on the list just for tracking purposes. And then we have, David, the log management discussion that you've initiated on the wiki with the content you provided there for review. And if I go back to the other slide, 1 minute here, then this, I don't know if I don't know what to put here yet for this. I figured we'll continue with the discussion, and then once I'm not sure how long you think it'll take to reach agreement on what the requirements are. Do you have any sense for how long we need to?
I would hope that we've reached agreement within the first sprint, to be honest, on what the requirements are, or before that.
Okay.
And then the work is going to be, I mean, it can be phased work, right? Where it's going to be a direction we're heading, and it's not going to be one or a team of 3 people doing the work. It's everybody kind of going over their code and adjusting.
Right.
Where there's going to need to be common work, if you will, is once there's agreement on the requirements, it's the agreement on how do we deal with log change notification, i.e. someone's went from debug to, error message logging on a certain thing. How's that communicated to the components and how that gets reacted? And so kind of that design phase. And then there's going to be a requirement on components to deal with that. So it's hard to say what this is in terms of how many sprints.
Yeah. No, I understand that. I'm just trying to get a sense for when we likely would start having some work scoped into active sprints.
Okay.
So I think
by
2 at least, but I think I'll leave this one blank for right now till we're a little further along.
Okay.
So, and then so scalability. This one, I think I'm not necessarily thinking we need an owner for this, but we have a couple items that need to be discussed there. So Sean Ying will probably I'll check with you later to make sure we have stories that are appropriate. We may still need some things entered there. And then the simulator, that needs further discussion as well as some of the other items. But this is sort of our start for looking how things are shaping up. So what I did was in this corner here, I just gave a rough estimate. So assuming I have 1 hardening sprint added after the development sprint. So if it says 4 here for development, it would be 5 to allow for estimating the release date so that we have a hardening sprint. So if I go on 4, 6, 8, 10, just some examples for the number of development sprints, this is where that puts our rough estimate for what the 2.0 release date would be. So in terms of something that we want to put on the wiki, I wanted to talk with this group right now to see if we have a sense of where we should put that date. So right now, knowing that OpenOMCI, until we have additional resources identified, it's going to put it in this time frame. so end of year 2018 or beyond. So we can either take the approach of, based on the work I know right now, we put in a draft date with an estimate for the release date of end of year. And then as resources are identified, then we can adjust that and publish a revised schedule later. Or we as a community try and figure out if we think we'll be able to get the required resources to cut the work, cut the number of sprints in half by adding a couple of contributors, for example. So I think the safe answer would be to initially publish this, because that's based on what we have currently, and we have a lot of unknowns still, for example, with what is required for this. But I think what we've had out there is really out of date, and I believe it still shows July as the release. So I want to make sure people aren't looking at that and expecting something in short order, because we're on a different path at this point. So option one would, I think, be to have a rough estimate of end of year and kind of clearly indicate on the slide that it is a draft schedule that we are going to be adjusting. And then I think from some side discussion I had with Sean, and also my trying to look at it and figure out if we could pull in some resources once they free up from other items to supplement the areas that have a large number of sprints. Could we pull something into, say, I think the timeline that folks, I've heard some people talk about, which is around September, and that would give us 6 development sprints, but does require additional identification of resources to work on key topics, for example. And it also does put pressure on the items that are not yet scoped out with user stories, and then have technical owners assigned for those as well. So my personal thought right now is likely this should be our target, but that's pending resources and further alignment of schedules for the items on this slide here. The initial thing that maybe we should present on the wiki, based on what we know at this point, perhaps should be end of year with, you know, big disclaimers about still in planning. So any thoughts or comments from the group?
So, Julie, one thing was, and we, yeah, sorry, I didn't think about that yesterday. Can we actually have something 2.0 as of September, and then 2.1 end of the December, that will include the open OpenCI stuff? Would that be possible, Strat? And, you know, the position to take, so at least the majority, if we're expecting the majority of the work will be done by the September.
So if I had more info, I might say yes. But right now, I have no idea if that will work for the timeline for technology profiles, which was one of the key redesign portions of 2.0. So hopefully that could be done by September, but at this point, I don't think I could give an answer for that. And then also for the other work, we have no estimates on story points yet today. So I don't know if that could be included in the 2.0 either, if we have it September, based on what I know today. So I think it may be something to consider, having a series of dot releases, since this is a very large effort. But at this point, I couldn't tell you if, based on our current resources and our current info that we have in JIRA, I couldn't tell you what would be in a release in September right now.
So we may have a different outlook after this afternoon's discussion with the Foundry, right? Or
that's my hope, but for right now, and so that's one aspect, is a discussion that we'll be having later today. And the other aspect is what is the amount of work that's going to be brought in by the items that are still open and under discussion? And how many resources will those require to complete that work? So this is still a big unknown in terms of estimated effort. So I suspect that OpenOMCI isn't going to be the only thing driving a longer release cycle for this one, because of how we're kind of staging in some of the work as well, and because of the dependencies of some items on earlier sprint work.
Nick,
you already have it done.
Do you have any other do you have any other questions or comments?
No. Amit, it's about midnight your time. Why are your kids still awake?
They're volunteering for work.
Hey, I like that.
Sorry about the time.
So I've got about 2 minutes before I need to hand this over to Tom Moore for the second portion of today's meeting. So I do want to also mention, Sean, I think, has been looking at trying to figure out when to have the next technical lockdown. And sort of later in September was a target he was looking at as a possibility. So if we could get enough resources and coordination across the various items we've got here to meet that date, this would work out well, but we've still got quite a bit in order to pull things in to meet that schedule. So I think there's a lot of further discussion. What I'd kind of like to know for today is if I were to put something up on the wiki with our revised, draft schedule, based on what people know on the call today for the resources available for development cycles from their teams, do you have a sense for if we'll be able to pull things in, or shall we start with, at this stage, what we know, which is really putting in a rough estimate of end of year, I think, and then indicating that we are planning to revise the schedule. It's still in planning.
Yeah, I would suggest going ahead with the end of year 2018, and if we can just try to put in really good estimates on our story points, we can maybe after 2 iterations, perhaps go back and replan.
Okay, that sounds good to me. Because I would just like to get that old one off of the view for folks so that they have a more realistic expectation if people come to the wiki and take a look at things. Any objections to this? Okay, I hear no objections, so I think I'm going to draft something up. Sean, I'll need to work with you on that, since I think
I'll be back to the office tomorrow.
Okay, so we'll try and get something updated and posted on the wiki with some clear indication that it's still in planning and still draft as we're doing resource alignment and story point estimates. Okay, so thank you for allowing me time to cover this with everyone today. And I'll be requesting additional help from the teams on kind of getting some estimates for who we have working on things, how many resources we've got working on specific scope items, and then, estimating the story points, estimating the number of sprints from that as well. So with that, I think it's
Julie,
yeah.
Thank you for the great job here. I need to drop to work with the foundry to
okay.
do some of the stuff, so I'm dropping now. Thank you.
Okay, thanks, Sean. And Tom Moore, I do see you're online. Are you ready for me to give you presentation rights?
Yes.
Great. Okay. So let me make you presenter. Okay, you should have presentation rights now.
Okay. Okay, can you see the presentation now?
Yes, we can. Thanks.
Okay. Just a moment. Let me could size this up a little bit. Okay. So this was VOLTHA security was a topic that we revisited in the TST meetings, and this is taking it in a quite another step. So the message is pretty broad, but I think it'll be fair for some questions to be asked based upon the proposal. So the topic that was originally raised at TST meetings was questions about security, such as least privilege in VOLTHA, and one of the JIRA tickets was used to address that. I put the slides in backup that we presented on the April 10th for that. That's really not what we need or want necessarily to address today. We do have something new, and specifically the next bullet is a major proposal here. So as a managed virtualized environment, the proposal is that VOLTHA should derive and leverage security requirements, security architecture, best practices, and open source solutions from other open communities. As ONF is a member of Linux Foundation, and as the ONAP project in Linux Foundation provides ONAP requirements for security and ONAP architecture and work in progress, provides much of these elements. Some service providers plan to integrate VOLTHA with ONAP, and although a service provider may not necessarily deploy VOLTHA under ONAP, the maturity, the ONAP security requirements, and the ONAP security solutions being developed in open source provide a good foundation for security requirements and user stories for VOLTHA. And just on a personal note, you know, or from my background working in AT&T, it would be very hard for us to try to take really generalized security requirements from AT&T. There's some NDA type issues there, and this is really where the benefit of the open community comes in. So really the idea is that there are mature requirements being developed there in open community, and they are oriented towards a data center orientation, not a necessarily service provider or a traditional telco service provider orientation. So that's the other main thing. So what are these requirements specifically in the references? I'm going to pull the web page over to look at this, but the ONAP release VNF requirements. So let me pull the page over to the screen. So just so you have a visual, does everyone see the web page there?
Yes.
On the screen. Okay. So then specifically under this page, this is essentially there's a book of requirements on a page, and so you'll see this is just part of the one big main page, and VNF security starts here. So it describes the categories of VNF security. There's about 140 plus to 150 requirements in these areas. So just to scroll through, there's the general security requirements. There's identity and access management requirements, API security requirements, security analytics requirements, and data protection requirements. And back to the slide, there's also some ONAP application guidelines and a logging guide in ONAP, and then there's other ONAP projects for security, including direction on open source. There's several. There's too many to list here, I didn't have a good ranking of what would be the most relevant. I think they get into the level of detail where we want to be on the user stories. This is just an aside, and it's because VOLTHA is just one of the essentially one of the applications we would deploy. But given at a ONF level, a provider may be using ONOS and tenant apps and XOS. Should this be raised to a cord level? Or maybe part of it is partly being addressed there, and I haven't necessarily aligned to it, but you know, I'm coming in here with a top-down orientation that essentially ONAP would integrate with VOLTHA. You know, maybe through a controller, but still it would be thought of as being in a cloud. Okay, so the next slide is where we get into some of the specific. Actually, I'll stop there. I should ask for questions or comments. Okay, the next, I hear no questions, so I'll go to the next slide. We can go back as needed. So this is very high level, and I decided let's just go with the categories that are in the ONAP release, and let's call these high level user stories, and create 5 user stories based upon this, and there may be detailed user stories that break out of this. Maybe these should be called epics, but general security requirements, and then the 5 categories that were on the ONAP requirements page. With respect to that, there are some things that we, I think we want to discuss in general, and this isn't necessarily limited to this, and this is just to get the user stories started. We may want to have some more discussion beyond this as we move through these user stories as what the model of developing and delivering these are, but and validating them are. But VOLTHA transaction, just finishing it somewhat on an implementation level. I just want to make a couple of notes on things I think we want to consider. VOLTHA transactions that change any configurations or perform any operator actions from any operator or automated interface should use a transaction ID as a best practice to perform effective security audit logging. This transaction ID, I should note, is in ONAP. So you can look in ONAP and transaction ID and see the context at which how they're doing it, and then I think we can determine how we coordinate with that with ONAP or do something similar as appropriate. And then there was a question we discussed, I think, just from a planning point of view the other day, and given the recent request for discussion about log management. Audit logging is a form of log management for security. It's just one case. There are other log management. There's obviously, I showed some links to logging practices and implementations in ONAP, and for purposes of just saying high level, we should align to the logging direction. I should say the line ONAP and the VOLTHA community logging direction together. Based upon this, I did take a quick look, and I think there are some definite things in this reference that Sienna's provided that may go beyond what's in some of the description of the objectives of logging, and they may be complementary. You know, the two together may be forming something better. Then one other general area of comment, and this is helped by the fact that there's a definition that the ONAP requirements provide for network cloud service provider, NCSP, and network cloud functions, such as the network cloud service providers IDAM, Identity and Access Management API, that is used for those functions. So essentially, the NCSP is customizing the authorization for identity management and the authentication and authorization for the users and what functions they can access. So I think that's a good partitioning as well for any such project. I think the providers will have some different implementations. But the point here is that for such requirements, we need to discuss whether and how VOLTHA should provide a reference implementation, such as for IDAM. So in general, the recommendation is user stories should define the delineation or interface to the NCSP implementation from a core or reference implementation within VOLTHA. For example, the reference implementation of configuration of access levels exists, but allow an NCSP to define and configure up to a certain number of access levels and the definitions of the access levels. And those are the two parts of the proposal for today, and the backup slides are just a reference to what we covered on April 10, which is just interesting from a background point of view, just shows some open items and closed items for security as well. So we can say at least, there are some things that I've covered here. One general comment I wanted to make about these requirements is that if you looked at security requirements before, a security architecture may actually, I'm going to go back to here where you say 140 plus requirements. A security architecture and best practices may actually help an implementation arrive to meeting many of the requirements already. The differences are things like scanning for special vulnerabilities or configuration of the IDAM functions, for example, that those have to be done in specific ways. Some of the logging requirements were very specific in, as you'll see, there's some of the requirements in ONAP where we're saying we're writing a requirement for every type of field type that they said that the security audit log should have. So I'm counting about easily 6 requirements that have different fields that should be that they specify for the security audit log. So I'm interested to think is do we think this is a lot to handle, or do we think we have some leverage, like I'm suggesting, that we have some direction in ONAP as an open source community that we may be farther along than just thinking in terms of, oh, there's 140 requirements we're bringing in.
Can you kind of rephrase that? I mean, I'm not sure what kind of answer you're looking for.
I'm just trying to drive some discussion here, so I haven't heard any comments.
Yeah.
So I do this sometimes. I throw the ball out and I try to get a bite, but that's my way of asking. I'm not hearing something, so I'm trying to get gut feel even on.
I probably, from my perspective, security is one of these things, right? Once you start peeling that onion, it gets more and more complicated the more things you want to do. And the question is, what are the things that we can actually accomplish or want to accomplish in this first go around? The list of 140 requirements, that scares me. It's probably accurate and required, but that number just scares me without having read them.
Yeah, that's fair statement, and that was the intent of my question, just to get that. And so what I'm suggesting here is that is a valid initial view. It is one that gave me some pause in terms of, I know what security brings. I understand the same thing that you just stated well, that in general you need, once you get in, I'll just say, once you get into the provider service or security domain, the internal security requirements audits will start. and they'll start with, you know, for example, they'll start with, in our case, the ONAP security requirements will be what are the e-commerce security requirements plus, you know, some specialized things. So what I do think, and what I think we need to do, and what I'm suggesting here is, like you're saying, break it down into the individual pieces, prioritize, see where we have leverage, such as on an implementation or something that's already in hand that can be the implementation that does it. So it doesn't. So each one of these 5 areas, there needs to be a divide and conquer approach on, and a prioritization approach, and absorbing what's really a requirement that requires code versus a requirement that's just met by, for example, at installation time of a VNF. You know, something that just following the VNF practices we're going to get already. And VNF practices meaning like a VNF deployment guideline.
Yeah, I mean, even some basic stuff is going to take some coordinated work in Volta. Like you talked about the transaction ID, which is really more request ID. I think it's I don't know how to define transaction here, right? It's not an atomic transaction, right? It's just saying here we want to be able to trace actions through the systems.
Yes.
To do that, and you know, making sure that as we call one component in Volta from the other, you know, now passing that transaction, right? That's whether we can pass that in context in like a header, or we have to start adding kind of that transaction or context as a parameter to our function calls, right? Something as simple as that has potentially large implementation.
Yes, I understand, and I don't know, you know, in terms of whether the all layers necessarily need to have it. For example, a transaction may be going to a certain layer, and then it calls down to another layer, and it's holding on to a response, and it has its own way of tracking that, but it only needs to hold the transaction ID up at its layer, but not push it down into the lower layer. Because the logging the logging should be happening from essentially where transactions are managed, not at every layer, you know, down into adapters, for example, should be.
Well, I'm not sure about that, because if I don't have that transaction ID down on my adapter, how do I, when I'm looking at log and trying to find out what went wrong, which includes a path down through the adapter, how do I know causality? Right? How do I know that? Yeah.
The question I have is what it's really more about. Where do we think we're going to log, and how, and that seems to be tied to this.
Yeah. And even in terms of performance metrics, right? You know, being able to trace those transactions all the way through the system to get not, you know, per component performance, but understand, well, how long did this transaction actually take? You know, those type of things you need that traceability. You know, if I looked at this upcoming sprint and said, hey, what's the first target? You know, that's one of the things that I would start speccing out, is how to deal with that transaction ID, because I think we need it regardless of the security issues.
Yes. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
So would that need to be added to OpenFlow as well? I mean, so every OpenFlow message has a transaction ID, or?
I think it would be. I think it would likely start once the message hits the core, i.e., that the northbound protocol adapters. So no, I guess I'll answer that way. I don't think we're adding something to OpenFlow, but once we're inside Volta, when one Volta component adds another or talks to another, then it would be, then the transaction ID would be involved. So once we're in the open flow agent, and we have a flow that we're pushing down. When it calls gRPC or sends a message to another component, that's when it would kick in. Is my rough thought.
How do you trace back what caused the initiation of whatever?
Well, again, going from the OF agent, there would be a log record that says, hey, got this open flow request. I'm sending it on with this transaction.
But how do we flow request came from? How do we tie that back to an operator doing something or Onos doing? I mean, how do we know why that open flow request happened?
Fine question. I mean, a lot of those open flow requests are going to happen in reaction to network events in VOLTHA. For example, once EA poll is authenticated, so once the user is authenticated, new flows are automatically pushed down, right? There's no user involved there. It is a reaction to authentication event.
How do we tie that together? We just know that type of flow comes from a authentication event.
Well, we know from Onos, we know the flow Onos pushed down, and so presumably if there's not a log in Onos, there's going to have to be a log added that says, hey, in reaction to this authentication event, I'm now pushing, this flow down. Right? There's no transaction ID.
Right. But if I'm correlating logs now, am I just doing it on timestamp?
No.
Am I just
not only on timestamp? We know from the Onos log, we should know what flow it's pushing down as well as its timestamp, to what device, right? And at that point,
so like a flow ID. So a flow ID so we know we're logging the flow ID or something like that.
When I push down a flow, you're not pushing down the flow ID, right? When you push down a flow, it's a match action.
I understand. I'm trying to correlate logs in multiple places, and I'm trying to understand how they fit together. And I'm grepping for something in a big, huge, long bunch of text across multiple files, trying to understand what happened or what initiated something or not.
I suspect we're going to be matching against kind of the match actions that are sent from OpenFlow, match action and device, so target, out of Onos into VOLTHA. So we're going to know what device, as it comes into the OpenFlow agent in VOLTHA, we're going to know what device it's targeted for. It's match and action thing, and so the correlation between Onos and VOLTHA is going to be around that, I would think. Plus.
Okay, and how do I explain this to an ATS person who's trying to figure out what happened, why a connection either failed or didn't, or why an authentication failed or didn't? I mean, how is an ATS person that's going to try to sift through some of this information before coming to somebody for technical support? I guess whoever that person may be. I mean, is this something that a developer has to do? Or is this something that we're going to be able to describe to an operations person of how to figure this stuff out for themselves?
Well, it depends on where we're going to do this correlation. Are we going to say, look, we're just logging the messages. There's this external system that's going to deal with the correlation, and it's going to have correlation rules to do that. Or we're going to say it's not, no one's going to do it.
I'm fine with an external system. I'm absolutely fine with that. But we have to be able to be very explicit in how do we find these events and how do we correlate with the events and what are the regular expressions that system will use to pull all of these various pieces of logs to get. So we need to be very, very detailed in those use cases and how those things get defined.
Agreed. I don't think we know the answers to all those yet. I don't even know if Onos has the proper logging to allow that correlation, and I don't know if VOLTHA does it today. And so That's one of the things that I think, in terms of this first sprint, would be valuable to start specking out and saying, both as part of security, as part of logging, we need this transaction capability, this traceability capability. Let's figure out how to do that. And then as part of that, understanding those correlation rules to show that, that we can demonstrate at the end of, whatever sprint, hey, we can now show traceability from a request from Onos in reaction to an authentication event, if you will, to the flow going all the way through the OAuth adapter core to the OLT new adapter, and we can see that traceability and logging, both in terms of a successful message as well as in terms of an errant situation.
So things, and we create tools on top to help us understand those things, then the syntax of those logs becomes fixed in stone forever, right? So now people can't go and edit their logs because they're like, oh, this log didn't read quite right, so I better go edit that log a little bit to change it to read better. I mean, if we're going to build tools on top of the text that's in the logs, then we have to be very careful about ever changing logs. So
there will be places where I think that absolutely is true. When there's no transaction ID, for instance, and you're correlating on data, right? First of all, so like the match action bit, we're logging. We're places where we cannot propagate a transaction ID. You're absolutely right. There are issues around that. I think we're gonna have to use structured logging though, as opposed to textual mappings, which means our log messages shouldn't just be text. There should be a data blob with it.
All right.
Okay.
Yeah. We're running up against the hour. I want to make sure I'm helping with the next steps. I'm going to help on this. I just a couple quick questions. Should these be epics? Yes or no? And then underneath, propose we rank the categories before we get to the user stories definition.
Right. I think part of this is still agreement between what you're doing here in security and some of the logging stuff, and we need to make sure that is specified as requirements someplace, if not both places. And then, I think we need to create epics and then stories behind it. Absolutely.
Okay, and then I think I have some ideas of how to prioritize these epics before we start prioritizing within the stories. And then I agree on the point about coordinating the logging stories. Okay. All right, Julie, that's what I want to cover.
Great. Thank you, and thanks everyone for the discussion. And we are out of time today, so I think we'll go ahead and drop the bridge after one last call for questions to Tom on the presentation today. Okay, I'm not hearing any other comments or questions, so thank you everyone for the discussion. And I'll post the recording later once we have that available, and then talk to most of you again on Tuesday. Thanks.
All right.